Now this is going to sound strange to some people, but for whatever reason, I never really had the desire to get invested in the John Wick movies. And it's not that I had anything against them, they just didn't really have a lot of appeal to me for some reason. But now that John Wick 4 is coming out, I thought it would be a great opportunity to familiarize myself with this franchise that a lot of people seem to really enjoy. So I binged watched the first 3 John Wick movies, and these are my thoughts. Let's discuss.
Jesus Christ, it's about time!
I watch so you don't have to.
So to be clear, the title of this video is only partially accurate. I actually did see the first John Wick movie when it first came out.
You sit on a throne of lies.
And I specifically remember that I saw it before the movie gained its cult following. I remember that not a lot of people were really talking about it yet. I just saw that there was a new action movie with Keanu Reeves, and I said sign me up. But here's the thing, when I watched it, I remembered it not leaving much of an impression on me.
Why are you the way that you are?
So when people started hyping it up, I was a bit confused by that reaction. But sometimes it does help to watch something for a second time so you can really soak it in. So this made me definitely very interested in revisiting the first movie specifically. But I have to be honest, I had a somewhat similar reaction this time around.
Move this man!
And to be clear, I'm not saying that John Wick is a bad movie. I just didn't find myself getting wrapped up in it as much as some people do. I'll start with the things I do like about the first movie because there is a lot to like. First off, I love how they build the legend of John Wick immediately. And that's kind of a lost art in movies now. Making your characters feel like a big deal organically. And that happens when you hear the way that other characters talk about him. And you see how people react when they find out it was his dog that was killed. It just instantly makes the character feel that much more important. And by the way, as an animal lover, I myself would probably react the same exact way.
Think you gonna get away with it? Not up in here!
Not up in here!
The other great thing that this movie does that a lot of other movies like it don't do is flesh out the unique world that John Wick operates in. This whole concept of a secret underground society that basically plays by its own rules was just very interesting to me, and it's all about the little details that contribute to this world building.
Rule number 32, enjoy the little things.
Everything from the gold coins to the cleanup crew that gets rid of the bodies, to of course the Continental. Basically the home base for everything going on in this world, in this particular area. And it's the place where all operations come to a stop. It's basically a safe zone. I really love this aspect of the movie, and I was looking forward to seeing how they flesh that out in future sequels.
I like it a lot.
Here's the thing, at its core, John Wick is kind of a basic revenge story. And that is the part of it that I found to be a bit underwhelming at times. Especially with your generic, one-dimensional Russian villains. Now I get it, this movie is supposed to be a throwback of sorts, but even in the classic action movies that it's kind of emulating or trying to channel, the villains in those movies were almost always memorable. And I didn't find any of the villains in the first John Wick movie to be even remotely memorable.
Not impressed.
Of course, all the action in this movie is great. Everything from the choreography to the framing of the shots. It truly does make these action set pieces look like works of art. I also enjoyed how they found new and creative ways to kill people in each movie moving forward. I did find the finale of this movie, or the final confrontation, to be a bit underwhelming as well. Especially since the whole movie is kind of built behind this hand-to-hand combat. And this fight did feel a bit lackluster to me, and maybe that was done on purpose to show how dangerous John Wick could be.
That makes sense.
Bottom line, I thought the first John Wick was okay, but nothing that was overly impressive to me. So then I moved on to John Wick 2, and I have to be honest once again, this was easily the movie I was least interested in while watching it.
You about to cross some lines.
This movie picks up pretty much right where the first one leaves off, with John Wick trying to retrieve his car from the brother of the Russian he killed in the previous movie. And that is kind of a reoccurring theme of these movies. Everything that you do will most likely have a reaction. So once you are in this life, it's very hard to get out, which makes the fact that John Wick escaped and then was kind of pulled back into it all the more tragic. And by the way, John's wife's death does loom over him throughout the series. So the plot of the second movie is basically John being sucked deeper back into the underworld.
Yeah, that's what she said.
now by this man who was the one who helped him get out initially. This man is still owed something, and that's where the concept of the marker comes into play, which is basically a blood oath that John Wick really can't say no to. Of course, John declines anyway because he's constantly going against the grain, and this in turn gets his house destroyed. Eventually, John has no choice but to go through with what this person wants him to do, and what proceeds is an assassination mission that feels like it took a bit too long to set up. And once it's all done, John gets double-crossed by the man who sent him there, and he is also pursued by his target's bodyguard throughout the entire course of the movie. They're clearly trying to stack the odds against the character of John Wick this time around. They're upping the ante for the sequel. And this is very clearly the goal of this franchise. They constantly have to one-up themselves. And that's another thing that I noticed, specifically starting in this movie, that John Wick does take an ungodly amount of punishment. Now, I realize this is a fantasy situation, but I can only really suspend disbelief for so long before things start to get a bit ridiculous to me, but more on that later. One refreshing addition this time around is the Bowery King, played by Lawrence Fishburne, mostly because it was great to see Lawrence and Keanu on screen together again. And I have to say, the system of bums is another cool addition to the world building. In this movie also, John gets a contract put out on him, and we've heard that said in 1,000 movies before, but in John Wick they actually show us what that process entails, which again was a pretty cool concept and a nice little wrinkle added to this to make it stand out from all the other movies like it. Whoa! Eventually it comes down to the villain, who is slightly more interesting than the previous one, but not much. Getting shot in the head by John Wick at the Continental, which is of course breaking the rules. But this does kickstart what in my mind is the best part of the John Wick franchise, period.
And here we go.
From the last 10 minutes or so of John Wick 2 to the first 30 minutes or so of John Wick 3 is basically peak John Wick for me. And yes, John Wick 3 is easily my favorite of the trilogy because of it. The way this movie begins with this whole countdown, basically to when everyone can come after John officially, there's just a lot of tension being built throughout the first portion of this movie. And then once the countdown is up, it's just this onslaught of attacks coming at John. And everything from the fight in the antique weapons store to the fight in the stables was just amazing to watch. This was more along the lines of what I thought I was getting into when watching John Wick movies. Just balls to the wall non-stop action. John Wick 3 is all about consequences, or dealing with the consequences of your actions. And John is being put through the ringer once again in this movie, as is Winston, a mainstay of the John Wick franchise, the manager of the Continental who gets hit with internal investigations of the underworld, simply because he chose to give John Wick a little bit of a break by giving him a head start.
Me, right?
The movie does slow down substantially when John Wick books safe passage to Casablanca, and we meet the Halle Berry character who has to reluctantly help John Wick find one of the elders, the only person who could grant John Wick forgiveness for all of his rule breaking. This definitely opened up the scope of these movies and put everything on a much larger scale. But once John Wick gets forgiven and gets a finger chopped off, he returns to New York, but he returns with a task. But in typical John Wick fashion, he refuses to complete that task.
Why?
He proclaims that he's not going to kill Winston, which is what they wanted, and Winston refuses to give up his power at the Continental. So the High Table sends a hit squad to the Continental to kill everyone. And this leads to some more very cool stylized action sequences. And some more creative kills as John has to find his way around the armor that these people are wearing. He also has the help of the Continental concierge, who also just happens to be John's trusty dog watcher, R.I.P. They pretty much kill everyone who was coming after them, but this is where the movie goes a bit south for me. Winston parlays with the High Table representative, which kind of seemed like a bit too of an abrupt solution to this issue, especially considering all the killing that just happened. Not only that, but Winston turns on John Wick and shoots him in order to keep his power. And then John falls off a 10-story building and somehow lives.
Inconceivable!
And this is the moment where it was starting to feel like when they made John McClane ridiculously indestructible in the later Die Hard sequels. Not going to lie, I did roll my eyes a little bit when he lived through this. Overall, there's things about the John Wick franchise that I enjoyed immensely, and there's things about it that I found to be a bit off-putting. I appreciate the attempt to make a straight-up action franchise based on an original concept, and going to great lengths to make the character, as well as the world he lives in, feel that much more special. I just wish there was a little bit more in these movies from an emotional or dramatic perspective, to make these situations mean a bit more other than just an endless line of killings. I also think the franchise could benefit from some stronger villains, which hopefully Bill Skarsgård will rectify in Chapter 4. I still had a decent time with all these movies, and I'm definitely interested to see where this story goes moving forward.
Y'all be cool. Right on.